Today we're going to spend a few minutes talking about Martin Luther King Jr. and how he effectively changed the civil rights movement. He helped create the civil rights movement, and how he was through the 1950s and the 1960s able to get civil rights legislation passed that affected mostly black Americans but extended civil rights and some would say human rights to all Americans. Martin Luther King Jr., if you remember from some of our past lectures, in the early 1950s, or I should say the mid-1950s, he really came into his own during the Montgomery bus boycott when Rosa Parks started that by refusing to remove herself and go to the back of the bus. His approach really was influenced by a gentleman by the name of Gandhi who lived in India, and Gandhi's approach really was one that he was extremely persistent. His idea was a little different. His idea was the British had ruled India, and he wanted the British out of there. He wanted the Indians to be able to rule themselves. And so he worked for several decades in effectively getting the British out of India so India could become its own independent nation. Well, Martin Luther King was aware of Gandhi. He was aware of his actions, and he looked at how he was able to, Gandhi was successfully able to do this, and thought this could be a pattern that we could follow in trying to make sure that all black Americans can have every right that an American citizen should have. His approach was called civil disobedience, and it was very interesting. Not only was it civil disobedience, but sometimes when we hear those words, we think of just somebody breaking the law. That's part of it, but it's also very important to know that it was non-violent civil disobedience. To break this down, maybe to keep it a little bit basic here, it's civil disobedience is a refusal to obey a law in an effort to cause change in government policy or in legislation. It's very important that the followers use only nonviolent means, meaning that when they are arrested, which they know they will be arrested, that they do not fight, they do not spit on the policeman, they don't curse back at them, but they politely accept it. Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself a little. Let me show you the process that Martin Luther King used in committing civil disobedience. Now, when I say a process, if you wanted to be a follower of Martin Luther King, if you wanted to participate in some of the rallies and in some of the movements, there were workshops where you could go to be trained because there was expectations. If you wanted to be part of the movement, you had to act as part of the movement. Now, the first step, Martin Luther King and his followers would break a law, but they would do it politely. Cheerfully accepted it all. Now, the power of this is members of the public, people that see this, you need to have these protests on television. You need to have people writing newspaper articles, magazine articles, photographs. These things need to be distributed to the general public. Now, when the public sees these protests, they see that the followers are acting in a very civil way but still breaking the law. Public sympathy begins to be aroused for the protesters and for their cause. Eventually what happens is members of the public end up putting pressure on the public leaders to negotiate with Martin Luther King Jr. Now here's an important part. Martin Luther King Jr. wouldn't back off at this point. He continued to put his foot on the gas and say we continue to need to have more pressure, more protests, and eventually what happens, a public leader would give into the pressure, would give into the protest, and would be forced to negotiate with Martin Luther King and his followers. An example of this, we've seen this before, is in Birmingham, Alabama, and we've seen some video footage of that. Those images had such an impact on people because people interpreted that as here are people who are peacefully protesting. They're not rioting. They are protesting, yet the fire department and the police officers are using such excessive force to put down a protest. It's something that was looked at as not even a public issue as far as a safety issue. It's just people were protesting. That was a perfect example of how Martin Luther King and his followers would use nonviolent means to protest to try to get a law changed. Martin Luther King's actions, nonviolent actions, were they defensive or offensive? They were offensive in the sense that he was constantly pushing for change. Martin Luther King's nonviolent actions designed to avoid violence. Here's an interesting part about this, yes and no. And Gandhi taught the same thing. As far as the followers, they absolutely could not commit an act of violence against the authorities or against the police officers. If they were getting beaten, they had to accept that as part of their protest. they were thrown in jail, they had to accept that. The idea here is, and I'll show you a picture of this image that I've shown before. We'll put this up. The young boy who's being attacked by the police dogs. How different would that image be if the young boy was protecting himself against the dogs and the policemen? How would people view that? If you saw somebody reacting against the dogs, you would think, now there's a criminal who's trying to run away, and the police are just doing their job. But when you see an image like this, now what it looks like is there is somebody who's being attacked by the police. So it's extremely important. The image of how you conducted yourself was an extremely important part of Martin Luther King's nonviolent civil disobedience. Okay, so a quick review of Martin Luther King and his nonviolent methods. The first thing is break an unjust law. You have to find a law that you think is unjust. Break that law. Be polite about it, and that's one of the key things. You have to consider your image and be polite. You will get arrested for it. That's part of the purpose, is getting arrested. Having media coverage, it is so important, because if you get arrested, thrown in jail, and then get released, and nobody knows about it, it's not going to do any good. But if the media is there to cover that, eventually what will happen is it'll create public sympathy. You do that over and over again, and eventually the public pressure will cause a change in the laws and the policies, and you will have a successful social movement.